Welcome to the Stack Exchange podcast, where we cast our thoughts and let our arguments resolve. I am your host, Tristan.
And I'm your co-host, Tyler. Today we're going to be talking about alternative win cons, such as commander damage, poison counters, mill, and other win-the-game effect kind of cards.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we should say that these will not, however, include any infinite combos and obviously not combat damage. That's just the way the game works. That's how you win. So let's get into it. I think the first thing we should talk about is probably commander damage. This is something that we've talked about in passing and quickly kind of stopped ourselves from discussing because like with each other, we know exactly that we have differing opinions on this, and I think we just wanted to wait until we had everything together to kind of hash it out. I don't know if it'll get like resolved today, but maybe we'll really get each other's opinion. Maybe one of us will be swayed.
Yeah, so to explain the stances we each have, Tristan is a supporter of commander damage, and I am not.
I am, yeah, yeah.
And a little preface, I used to play Voltron a decent bit. Like I had a Skullbriar deck that I enjoyed. I guess should I start explaining my side
I
first, or
mean,
would you like to explain yours first?
no, yeah. I think to your point, I hate Voltron as a like archetype for a deck. Like maybe I have a few ideas. I'm gonna talk about them
Yeah.
at a
Okay.
different time. But at a different time, maybe I'll talk about like some of these ideas that I have. But just to like preface, like I maybe to your point, I think Voltron is awful, and I think that it's just like it quickly becomes like arch enemy to some extent because it's like
Yeah.
he killed that one guy and now he can kill me with his unblockable guy, or it's like there's no way that you can't instant remove it, right? It's not like a value engine where it's like he's gonna be creating like food tokens or whatever every time.
Mm-hmm.
No, this is something you know he's gonna slap like a Whisper Silk Cloak and Lightning Greaves on, and you can't do anything about it. So I think it kind of creates like a not fun play pattern of once people know like you're running a Voltron deck, they almost have to deal with it right away. And you mentioned you played Voltron before. I feel like that was especially true for like Skullbriar, which is the
Yeah,
deck that you
for
played,
sure.
which is like he accumulates the counters, and it's just like you can't even let him hit you on turn one, basically.
Yeah.
It's just always a deficit. So I think Voltron's lame, but not because of commander damage. I think for other reasons. Like it's not a fun play pattern. It creates arch enemy. It's like the epitome of like a monolith commander too.
Yeah.
Where it's just like your deck doesn't work without your commander because your whole deck is around your commander doing damage.
I'm of a slightly different mindset in that I think Voltron is fine without commander damage. Because most of the time, why commander damage is such a threat is because you only need to deal 21 damage that they can't heal to just knock someone out of the game. If it's you have to do the full like 40 damage, that's a lot more to work towards. And when you're doing Voltron, you have one commander, so you're only really you have to spend a lot of time to beat down one person, and you can't work towards multiple people. So instead of having the advantage of only having to kill like essentially 1.5 people, you have to kill 3 people with one guy. So even if you had 40 counters on him, you'd have to get 3 unblocked attacks through to kill someone. That's my thought process on it. At least why I think that Voltron would be better without it, because it would just be a lot easier to live through Voltron without commander damage.
Yeah, that's fair. I see the idea, and maybe this doesn't make any sense what I'm about to say, but I feel like that is almost an argument for why it's okay to keep it. Like it's just like about the mindset. Like if a Voltron deck is fine without commander damage, then why do you need to take it away? Like yeah.
It's
I guess
because
it.
it makes it too much of a threat. Like you said, you sit down with a Voltron commander, it's like, well, shoot, this guy can melt you so fast. But then if you it's essentially going from like, let's say you were doing a damage only deck, removing commander damage is like making everyone's HP suddenly 80. Like a go wide deck has to put in a lot more work. for it, and thus it's a much lower threat if everyone had 80 HP instead of 40. I think it's the same kind of mindset with Voltron, where instead of having 21 HP for Voltron, they have 40. It significantly lowers your threat rating. Like you still might become an arch enemy depending on what guy you run as a Voltron. That's just an inevitability. But your threat drops a whole lot, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's fair. I I think that's fair. Um, yeah, that's a good point. I think that for while that's true, it's also like the kind of mentality around like people who are going to be playing like big stompy dinosaurs. I know that's like a little more go wide, but
Mm-hmm.
it's the same thing. Like you have to find a way around like combat damage and also like protection. Like
Mm-hmm.
it would it yeah. I mean it makes some cards a lot better. And yeah, I agree. I think it does help fix Voltron. But I
I
think it
definitely
provides
think it fixes Voltron.
I think that commander damage overall though like provides more of a positive benefit. Um I'll give a reason why. And I'll say this with one of my decks in mind, but it's the idea that it gives some decks like an alternative win con, and that's kind of like what commander damage is in general. But there's some decks like for the most part, like I have a Sam deck, and Sam is just going to be tiny the whole time. He's going to create value, and so in that case, like commander damage isn't going to help me out at all. But in a deck that I have a Vadrock deck, Apex, I think it's like yeah I gotta figure
That's
out
the
what
like
exactly.
13 card combo, whatever, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. In that deck, there's some cards that give him 7 power, and I think he has flying and vigilant. Yeah, he has flying and first strike, and there's an like X number of cards in there that will give him 7 power. And I think that that is really helpful in like a spell slinger deck where I'm casting a ton of spells, maybe doing this like 13 mana 7 card infinite combo. But
Mm-hmm.
if all else like falls through, I have something to kind of close out the game because like 7 flying damage probably won't close out a game, especially if someone has any sort of like life link or is running like a life gain deck, or people are going to be losing life faster than that. So I think that the commander damage kind of helps with that. It's a
That's
backup in those scenarios.
That's fair. Like commander damage is there to it's essentially a way to counter to give you a win against life gain decks. It's just a built-in for only life gain that it stops really. And in a four-person format, even if you're running a spell slinger deck, what's Vadrock's power toughness?
3/3.
3-3. I still feel like even if you can make him a 7-7, doing 7 just damage like later in the game is going to be fine. Also, Vadrock's chain infinite turn deck, right? That's how you built him.
Yeah. Yep.
So I think in the end, everyone's going to end up lowering each other's HP unless everyone's playing combo alternate win cons.
Yeah. I think it kind of just helps the game go faster a little bit though. I mean, yeah, obviously if I start chaining it turns, it's going to be helpful. But if I can't find a way to guarantee chain my infinite turns, Vadrock being at 7 and swinging in is going to end the game quicker for me than if there wasn't commander damage. And I think what I'm about to say, there may be an exception to the rule, and I will point it out. But overall, I think commander damage is there when you need it, and when you don't need it, you don't need it. It's almost not very applicable. Like if I'm running a go wide deck with a value commander in the command zone, like a value engine, something that's just going to be creating mana or like giving my entire team like a +1/+1 buff. I think like in that situation, obviously you're not going to need commander damage. But if you have like my Vadrock deck where you are going to get to 7 power and be able to kill someone in 3 combats, it's meaningful when it matters. And my counter to myself is I have built an Ob Nixilis Captive Kingpin deck. And in that deck, he's a value
I'm
commander
gonna talk
that
about
can
that
just,
card.
that can just sit there and build value and value and value. And then when you don't need it, after you've cast all your cards from exile and stormed off, you can swing in with a 2020 Flample commander to just cap it all off. Like, I think in that case, it's a counter to my argument, right?
Okay, I think that makes a really good transition into what I was going to talk about because I have Ob Nixilis Captive Kingpin pulled up right in front of me, and it's just commander damage can make him such a larger threat. He is just by default a value engine. Whenever an opponent loses exactly one life, you get to exile a card from the top of your library and play it until your next turn. So that's just by itself good. On top of that, they made it put a counter on him, and they gave him flying and trample. So not only do you get insane card draw, essentially, you suddenly have this huge threat of a flying trample like 2020 guy. And I think this kind of transitions into the part of where I think commander damage is bad for commanders that want to get value by combat damage or by attacking because it makes them a larger threat than they need to be. Let's see, the next commander I think I could mention is something like Brago, King Eternal. He wants to deal combat damage to flicker everything. His is a little less on the so because he has lower power. But once again, that starts to accumulate over the turns as you're flickering all your stuff to deal combat damage. And I think a really important one to mention is Obeka Splitter of Seconds. She gets an additional upkeep equal to the amount of combat damage she does. You don't build Obeka to do Voltron damage. You build her to do upkeeps. And you get more upkeeps by boosting her power, but that also makes her a larger threat because now she's doing larger commander damage.
Yeah.
The last one I thought
I
of
think-
as well was Gishath's son Avatar. Like it's a 7/6 vigilance trample haste dinosaur, so it's already a pretty good beater, but you want to deal combat damage so you can dump out all your dinosaurs. That's usually what you build Gishath as. You're not building them because you want to finish people off with Gishath. You want to instead dump a bunch of dinosaurs onto the battlefield, and he dumps as many dinosaurs essentially as the power, as much combat damage as he does. So that makes it so you get less triggers, or people are less likely to let you hit with him.
I think that that's a good point. As far as like attack triggers go, there are some things that will like allow you to pull creatures back
Yeah.
or untap them, remove them from combat. If you just want attack triggers and you don't want to be threatening the commander damage, but obviously a lot of the time it's easier to just slap a this creature can't be blocked sort of enchant on them, aura,
Yeah,
any
'cause
sort of artifact.
there's a lot more of those. Like the ones I think of on the top of my head to pull stuff out of combat is Reconnaissance, which is in white, and then Maze of Ith, which is a colorless land, which I usually
Yeah.
run in my attack trigger decks, especially if they're white.
Yeah.
Because also with those, you don't want to worry about like losing your commander, so those are just good cards in general for those kinds of decks.
I think kind of like on a side tangent almost, but as a point to that, like there's a lot of fogs in green that you could run. So if you do want the attack triggers, you can cast
Ooh.
fogs, and people may not feel like the impact of your commander damage.
I never thought about it that way, but yeah, you could run fogs in an attack trigger deck.
But does that work if you're preventing damage? Does it? Yeah, it prevents commander damage.
It
right?
does
If you-
not work for a combat damage deck, but it works for a attack trigger deck.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is like preventing combat damage stops commander damage from hitting people, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's preventing it from hitting. No, that's a good point. I think like especially with those value cards, you want to be getting the attack triggers, combat triggers, but people are going to be accumulating the commander damage and see you as a bigger threat than maybe you are.
Mm-hmm.
But I think almost to a counterpoint is that's the cost of having that in the command zone, right? You can easily put that in the 99 of a deck and still build a deck like that and have it work like how you want it to, where it's going to attack. People won't feel as threatened because Obeka's what, a 2/4 with Menace, I think.
2/5,
Um,
I think.
Yeah, Obeka's a splitter of seconds to be clear. We'll
Yeah.
we'll throw it up for you guys. Obviously you're going to be getting value off the combat damage,
Hmm.
but if you have that in the 99, people aren't going to be worried about the commander damage as much. And so I think it's almost a way of like checking people's greed, right? If you want access to a spell that's going to constantly generate value off of combat, and you want that in the command zone and constant access to it, then you're going to have to deal with the fact that people are going to see it as a bigger threat. I think it's almost a way. Whoa, sorry. I think it's almost a way of balancing out the fact that you have 100% access to this card all the time. So.
I guess that's kind of fair. I think one of the problems I have for Obeka specifically is that there's no Grixis commander you could run that cares about like upkeeps except her. Everything else is in like blue or less colors than Grixis, so you can never run her in the 99 of it.
It would definitely be like a loss of synergy. Like, I
Yeah.
agree.
You'd end up having to put like a throwaway commander, not a throwaway commander, some other value generation commander in the command zone. Also, a reason why I prefer to have the ability to be in the command zone is because of if it's not, it's so easy for a white player to exile it and your entire game plan falls apart. Like if I want to
Yeah.
build around a card that I want to like build my deck around, but I don't want to be my commander, it's so easy for them to just get removed by a white player and you never see them again and everything falls apart.
No, I totally agree with like the how scary it is to have something exiled. I think I mentioned I'm building a hidden commander deck around God Pharaoh's Gift,
Hmm.
and with like the amount of artifact hate out there, I just have to put a lot of recursion in the deck. But getting it exiled, I have almost no answer to in mono blue besides like just countering. So
Yeah.
that's a valid point
The
for sure.
only color that can deal with something getting exiled is white because of one card that we recently discovered, Pull from Eternity, which I love by the way. But that's the only card you can do to pull something out of exile, or more specifically anything out of exile, depending on
Yeah.
what you're running as your stuff. So that's why I just think there's a problem with like stuff that could be your commander having to run it in the 99. Like it getting sent to the yard, recursion is very simple to do, but dealing with exile of something is a real problem. And if your deck can't really stand alone by itself, then it can have a real hard time. So sometimes if you want to do like a huge synergy with your commander, like of course this is going into the problem with monolith commanders, and that's kind of what the problem is with the hidden commander. But if you don't have any backup plans, it can kind of just your deck can kind of fall apart, and then you just kind of bumble around and do nothing.
Like quick side note, there's a few cards that do from exile, sort of.
Yeah,
Um,
I just
there's like
pull from
the
eternity is the
mirror.
only one that is literally like any card.
It's the only one that's playable. Honestly, there's Mirror of Fate, which is tap sack it, choose up to 7 cards, face up in exile that you own, exile all the cards in your library, and put those exiled cards on top of your library.
Yeah.
I mean, but that's like not
There's
playable,
also
really.
Rift Sweeper, which does Rift Sweeper doesn't pull it to its
Yard, it pulls
owner's
it to
graveyard. It pulls it to your deck. So I guess that one's better. I thought Rift Sweeper was originally just creatures,
yeah,
but I guess Rift Sweeper is an option. It just
yeah.
doesn't
It's
pull
not
it to yard.
instant. It's one extra cost. It's on a creature. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah, there's very few cards that can do it. To your point, though, so
green and white are the only colors that can do it. So for the Obeka example, which has neither of those colors, it can't do
yeah.
it.
I think to maybe sort of wrap up the commander damage section, my last point, at least that I have, is that I think it's kind of just like the core of EDH. It's literally called Elder Dragon Highlander, and the reason that you have commander damage and it's 21 specifically is because the format was made around the original Elder Dragons, Nicol Bolas, Chromium, Acades, Palladia, and what's that Jund one? Uh, I can't even say that name.
I'm
Anyway,
surprised you remember that many. I only ever remember Nicol Bolas.
yeah. Vivictus. To me, obviously, I've not been playing long enough to remember when Commander was created, not even close. But at its core, it's based around these dragons. And the reason you win with 21 is because all of them had 7, and the creators decided, hey, if you deal combat if you hit someone 3 times with your commander, that's good enough to win the game. And obviously, that was a different time when they had higher casting costs. But I think it would almost make it like a different format. It like takes away what made it its format. um, it's a step away from the idea of like a casual format where there's kind of this goofy way to win and something more competitive where strictly you can only win in these ways and there's no other thing.
Counterpoint to that, I think same argument, opposite mindset. I think it makes it less casual to have commander damage because at the time, I think commander damage was perfect. Like, let's look at the original stuff. Nicol Bolas is literally an 8-cost commander that you have to pay 3 every single upkeep to keep. So,
I mean,
at the time, getting hit 3 times by such a big, expensive monster, it makes sense. Yeah, if someone's able to hit you 3 times with such an expensive thing, of course that should be the end of the game. But I think how Commander is now and how stuff like Voltron is now, I think it's not really in the same spirit that commander damage was originally added. And that's why I think it would be fine to remove it. Even though that's what it was originally, I don't think commander damage serves its original purpose really anymore.
I think like ultimately it kind of comes down to like what you want to do, and there's definitely like the rule 0 conversation of, hey, no commander damage. But if someone built a Voltron deck and wants to do commander damage, you can't just like shut that off.
I think that kind of summarizes our thoughts on commander damage. Should we move on to the next topic of poison counters? Tristan, what's your general thoughts on poison counters?
It's so difficult. I think that every time I see someone with a poison counter deck, it's like I know I'm on a clock for like 10 turns basically. And it's not my favorite thing to play against, and my main reason is how uninteractable it is. I guess this is kind of an argument for commander damage, but it's a little different maybe because there's less of a requirement. If I even get 1 poison counter on me against a proliferate deck, that's it. There's nothing I can do to stop this unstoppable machine, right? If I get commander damage, yes, that's going to stay forever, but I'm going to have to, but I can remove their commander, stop combats, fog, all of that stuff. But for poison, I either counter their proliferate spells or their proliferate triggered abilities, which is not an easy thing to do repeatedly. And eventually I think you're just going to lose the game if you don't get the poison play route.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I dislike poison for a lot of the reasons I dislike commander damage, aside from the fact that it limits what commanders you can use. I think the fact that, like I said, commander damage you can sometimes kill too quickly, and with stuff like Infect now instead of having to do 21 damage, you only have to do 10. I think that's just even worse. Of a mindset, on top of the fact that Infect puts -1/-1 counters on creatures. Like, what the hell? I also agree with that. Once you have a poison counter, if you're against a proliferate deck, it's just kind of over. I think it works perfectly as a backup win con to certain decks. An example is my Azuri Claw of Predation deck. We were playing a game not too long ago where everyone got a poison counter on them because of someone else played an Ichor Rats, and put a poison counter on everyone, and I used it as an alternate win con. I stormed off with proliferate triggers, essentially. And that's how I ended up winning the game, was a last-ditch effort of proliferating the heck out of people. And I think it works in that sense of being a alternative win con, but the fact that it can be made into someone's main win con is just so rough. It can also give you such unexpected wins. Someone throws a big creature at you and you're like, oh, I'll be okay, and then they Firesius it and just infect, do 10 damage. I think a way to balance it would be to, 1, make it not a counter so it can't be proliferated, or 2, raise the limit to like 15 or 20. I think that's a better way to balance it, but I don't like poison counter that much the way it is. I play it the way I like it, which is as a backup win con with like maybe 1 or 2 cards in the entire deck that do poison.
I think that as a finisher, it's a moot point for me because a Triumph of the Hordes being played is pretty equivalent to Craterhoof Behemoth or a Moonshaker Cavalry coming out.
I agree.
It doesn't. Yeah, it's gonna take the board out whether they played the Craterhoof, whether they played the Triumph of the Hordes, maybe with a little less than you were expecting. But I mean, this is sorcery speed, and it's only pumping the team +1/+1 for Triumph of the Hordes. So I think that as a finisher, something like Triumph of the Hordes, I have it in a few commander deck. I have the aura that gives infect in a few of my decks where I have some big creatures, so I can sort of knock people out in one hit as a backup win con. But that's a little more telegraphed, in my opinion, like putting the enchantment on it. Whereas something like Tainted Strike, I think, is one of the more harsh sides of infect and where people don't really like it, right? You have a creature coming at you. Yeah, it's a 10/10 in the air. You can't block it. Maybe you could remove it, but you want to hold up your removal for the combo player next round, next turn. But then they throw a Tainted Strike on that creature and you're out of the game. So there's not much you can do. Overall, infect is not a great strategy. I think it'll get you targeted out of the game. People don't like playing against it. But if you want to run a Triumph of the Hordes, that's the way to go with infect.
I agree. Triumph of the Hordes is one of the cards I run in some of my go wide decks as a finisher. Like in the Azuri deck I mentioned previously, it's one of the win cons because it's essentially like a Craterhoof overrun kind of an effect, except the card is cheaper. It's only $15 compared to Craterhoof's. What is Craterhoof at now?
I think it might have come down.
I think it got reprinted. So yeah, it's now at 11 now. So yeah, I agree. In go wide decks, it's essentially the same thing.
I also think that Toxic was the right way to do it.
I agree. I think Toxic is the way that they should have done Poison. In fact, I think ruined Poison. I think Toxic was perfect. Certain things only do like 1 poison counter and whatnot. Like if it was Toxic instead of infect, and then maybe it wasn't counter, so you couldn't proliferate it, I think it would have been a fantastic concept.
Right. I think exactly. Like Toxic, no matter how big the creature gets, it has Toxic 1. You're getting 1 poison counter. But with a guy that you can throw infect on, I mean, and something with like Tainted Strike, again, you can just throw that on anything, and it's going to deal poison counters equal to its power, which is just, yeah, it's a much crazier win con. But I feel like for how strong it is, I don't really see it as much. I feel like it's almost like a self-solving problem. People don't like playing against it, so they don't really play it. And when you do see it, people can kind of like join forces to take that player out.
I agree. I think Poison has become partially like a social taboo for people to build a deck around it, at least if they're doing infect. So that I feel like we don't see as many because everyone's like, Poison sucks to play against. So
yeah.
And also sometimes it can be a boring game plan because the game ends so quickly in a very uninteresting way.
Yeah.
Like by comparison, my Zada aggro deck can end games quickly, but there's so many more steps to it than big infect guy smacks you once, you lose.
Or spell, give everyone poison counter, proliferate.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't lean to very interesting gameplay. I think the taking of Toxic and Withering and smashing them together to create infect was not a good idea.
Yeah, for sure. I think, yeah, people who are playing infect also know they're going to be that person at the table. But aside from like a few new players who were like, wait, you can win in just 10, right? I think a lot of us have been there. It's just people don't want to play that strategy. And if they do, they really do. And they know that they're going to be like that guy sitting down at the table, and they're prepared to have everyone, swing out at them and maybe it be a quick game. Yeah, I think it's mostly a self-solving problem. The next one we really want to talk about is Mill. And out of all of these win cons, like just to start it off, I think that this is the most fair.
I 100% agree. I think Mill is a very fair win con, but that might be because compared to every win con, it's a little weak for the most part, unless you're running what's the guy's name, Bruvac, whatever.
Bruvac Traumatize.
Yeah, Bruvac Traumatize. Unless you're running Bruvac Traumatize, any other Mill commander is pretty fair in my opinion.
I agree. I think the difference is commander damage, you're taking it from needing to deal 120 damage to 63 or whatever it is.
Hmm.
Poison, instead of dealing, 120 damage, you need to deal 30. But with mill, you're going from 120 to needing to mill 300 cards, give
Yeah.
or take, right? People are going to be drawing. It may be easier than doing damage, but not by that much. Also, you can also play into people's doing commander damage to someone is rarely going to play into someone else's theme. Giving people poison counters, I don't know, will hardly play into someone else's theme. Maybe if someone else is running a poison deck, right? But mill, the amount of decks that just love throwing stuff in their own graveyard to reanimate it, get it back, find combos, basically use their graveyard as their second hand is way more than any deck that's going to be enjoying commander infect damage.
I agree. I think though that makes mill a little worse. It does make it fair, but it does make it slightly worse because depending on who you're playing against, mill just might help your opponent way more
Yeah,
than
exactly.
you can win. Because like some mill wins can be kind of slow depending on the deck. One of my first decks was a Phenax mill deck, and that deck was not very fast. And if you play that into a graveyard deck, you're helping your opponents out a lot more than you're harming them. For those who like to put stuff in their yard, mill players are like, oh yes, I love to have you as an opponent. Everyone else is like, stop throwing my stuff away. You walk up and you grab their sandwich and toss it in the trash in front of them and be like, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah, no, for sure. I think that it's like kind of the idea behind like why people hate stacks and control. It's like these are cards that you put time into putting into your deck and you're never going to get to play them now. I think that there's better ways to go about mill though. One of my decks that I play is the Mind Flayers Precon from Baldur's Gate.
I think Captain Nagathrod is like the greatest commander for mill ever. I love him so much because I'm a combat damage guy. So not only is he swing wide, mill your opponent, but then he steals their stuff. And
Yeah.
back when we first started playing and you had that Captain Nagathrod deck, we didn't have a concept of power levels, so that deck really did some damage.
Yeah, for sure. I think like the idea of milling for some sort of other bonus is great. Like having consuming aberration in the deck and then being able to, make it unblockable or give it menace or some sort of evasion. You're going to be doing a ton of damage with that, but you're not trying to really mill out your opponents necessarily. Like, yes, that's a win con that you can go for, but stealing their stuff from the yard and then buffing up your guys based on mill is a much better way to use mill. So as like an alternate win con, I think it's just better as like a strategy to like create value for yourself rather than trying to win through someone decking themselves.
I think it makes a good like subtle win con. It's not super strong. There's plenty of ways to get around it. Recursion. If anyone has a single Eldrazi Titan in their deck, you just don't win.
And I know of people who put like shufflers in their decks just to prevent mill.
Yeah, if you put something like an Eldrazi Titan that auto shuffles,
You're not getting
mill
milled
decks
out.
cannot beat them. That's why if you're running a mill deck, you kind of want to have something like Leyline of the Void that exiles anything that's put in the yard by default.
There's a ton of cards that do it too.
Yeah, that's just the one I'm thinking of off the top of my head. Or if you're running Umbris Sphere Manifest as your mill deck because they exile stuff instead of milling it. That does weaken some of your other cards like Consuming Aberration, but it does actually make it a more decent win con because you don't have to worry about someone having a shuffle engine in their deck.
I think that this is a really good transition into the last talking point, which is just cards with you win conditions stapled onto them. Talking about mill, this is obviously a setup for cards like Laboratory Maniac, which is just decking yourself is going to win. And that's a bit of a transition from milling your opponents. So instead of looking at milling 300 cards in a game, you only have to mill 100 cards. And that's yourself. Those are your own cards. And then you just win the game.
Yeah, exactly. And it lowers it makes mill, self mill, I think, is the best way to play mill because of recursion stuff and stuff like Laboratory Maniac. If you really just want to like empty someone's deck as a mill player, doing a self mill Laboratory Maniac kind of deck, or the other one is, let me see,
Wielder of Mysteries.
Jace Wielder of Mysteries. Yeah, another one where you can just deck yourself. I think that's just a good way to play mill if you want to, and it makes playing a mill deck a little better since you don't have to mill 300 cards off of people.
There's also like play in there too. Everyone knows about Muldrotha, obviously. So you can just play Muldrotha, get a ton of value out of your graveyard, and then if anything ever goes bad, you can just use the Muldrotha ability to cast Laboratory Maniac and deck yourself and win. It's like a contingency.
In the same vein as like the Laboratory Maniac win, there's Thassa's Oracle, which is used very often in CDH, where you deck yourself and then play Thassa's. That one's harder to interact with than Laboratory Maniac. Laboratory Maniac, you have to draw the card while your deck is empty. Thassa's is just a cast trigger.
ETB trigger. So you at least get to deal with that, but it's if your devotion is greater than the amount of cards in your library, you win. So it's not even, you don't even need to draw to have it go off. You don't even need to deck yourself fully, right? If I'm running a mono blue deck with a ton of devotion, I'm going to be able to get down to like 10, 12 cards and be able to resolve Thassa's. Obviously, it's played very intensely in CEDH. I mean, if you think game-winning combo, the first thing you go to is Thassa's Oracle, Demonic Consultation. But I think that it could have a potential place in like Casual Commander as an alternate win con. I'm actually playing it in one of my mono blue decks as kind of like a Laboratory Maniac. But something to note with these cards is when you put it on the battlefield, or when you play a card like this, you're declaring, I am going to win the game eventually, right? It's not like maybe I'll win the game through combat damage, but if I don't draw into these cards, I won't. These cards seem and feel and play more inevitable. And so my biggest thing with these is if you're going to throw one onto the battlefield, you better back up what you're saying. In no situation am I going to just like turn 2, throw out like a Simic Ascendancy, which is another one we have on here. I mean, potentially, but I want it to be a little more explosive than that. I think that's the main issue with these cards as well, right? It's like, hey, I'm going to win, but like not yet. And then people are like, hey, let's kill that guy. And then we can like go back to what we were doing.
Yeah, I agree. Throwing those cards out kind of doesn't, it keeps your win con from being hidden. You're showing your hand essentially.
I think that also them kind of playing openly is the one redeeming quality about them. You give your opponents a chance to respond to it, and a lot of these Simic Ascendancies, when we talked about Triska Dectafile, and also Revel in Riches is another one that is going to trigger on your upkeep. So it gives some time for your opponents to respond, and in the meantime, they almost feel like do-nothing cards. And I know that all of them have some other things stapled onto them. Revel in Riches actually has a pretty good one. But at the same time, people are going to be able to play around it a little bit and find ways to remove it before you get to that upkeep. And if you're playing it out with 2 treasures and no way to make treasures, it feels like a way to kind of target yourself off the board. You have to be careful. You have to know what you're doing with these cards.
Yeah, I agree. That's the fact that they kind of show themselves early is a redeeming quality over something like combos, which we'll get into at a later date. But like combos can come really out of nowhere. These usually you can see it coming. You see the card out there usually beforehand, and you're usually able to do something. You've got like a turn rotation most of the time before most of these go off, because they usually have like an upkeep trigger, like upkeep, fulfill this condition, you win.
Yeah,
so for the most part, you're able to foresee what's going to happen.
I think one of the fairest versions of this is the Maze's End, where you're having a land that needs to tap to go find your gates, and it's entering tapped, and then you have to activate the ability to go find the gates, and it costs 3. I think that out of all of them, this is definitely the most fair version of it.
I agree. Maze's End is definitely a fair one because gates just aren't insane.
Yeah, we got some with Lord of the Rings that aren't bad.
Yeah, we got some that aren't that bad. There are some cards, though, that make this kind of crazy. Reshape the Earth. It's a 9-cost green sorcery. You search for 10 land cards and put them onto the battlefield tapped. It does have some stuff, but at that point, it's a really boring win con, to be honest.
Yeah.
And that's because it's a solitaire win con, where you're playing the game by yourself. You're literally playing lands and then activating one ability once you have enough lands. It's just not a very interesting combo. It's not very interactable also. Most people in casual EDH don't play land destruction because it's become a bit of a social taboo.
Yeah.
So people aren't going to really have a way to like wipe out all your gates for it or something like that.
Right. I think that that's the downside to a lot of these too, is it turns it into a game of solitaire where with Laboratory Maniac, I don't care what my opponents are doing. If my life total doesn't drop to zero, I'm gonna keep milling myself until I can get that trigger and win the game. I don't care, if my opponents are fighting each other or trying to take me out. As long as I can survive until I have enough counters on Simic Ascendancy, I'm just gonna keep dumping mana into that. I'm not gonna try and cast any spells to change the game really. If I have extra mana, I'm going to be finding ways to put counters onto stuff for Simic Ascendancy, and continue trying to get, work towards that. It does become a game of solitaire. It's not as fun.
That's why I think that these alternate win cons work really good as your backup plan. For
Right.
instance, Simic Ascendancy, I believe, is in my Azuri deck. It's there for if I'm not getting through to smack people in the face enough, I can dump this out, put a bunch of counters on stuff, so then I have that as an alternative way to win. I
Right.
don't think you should make them your main game plan. And that's the problem with Maze's End specifically. Maze's End, if you're going to put that in as a win con, that is your win con. Like, that is what you are building it around. You can't really,
Right.
throw that in as an extra because gates on their own aren't fantastic. I think there's one commander that really cares about gates, and in the end, they're just a Maze's End deck.
I think one of the most busted version of these cards is Mechanized Production. It enchants an artifact you control, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you create a token that's a copy of enchanted artifact. Then, if you control 8 or more artifacts with the same name as one another, you win the game. The most important thing to note is it doesn't have to be the artifact that's enchanted, which I think is kind of a missed opportunity on balancing this card from a game dev standpoint, because it's so easy to get 8 treasures, 8 clues, or 8 food, something that is easy to generate compared to trying to, I think what the card wants to do, right, which is get 8 copies of a artifact like Swiftfoot Boots or something. It's kind of unfun, and it's something that can just come in, and you're in blue. There's a ton of ways to cast this at instant speed, right, and get that trigger. Also, blue's pretty good at making clues, so.
Yeah, I agree. The fact that it doesn't have to be the enchanted artifact definitely makes it a lot scarier. Honestly, I think this card could be fairly decent even if it didn't have the win con stapled to it. Upkeep, make a copy of the enchanted artifact. That's just in general not a bad ability to have. And then they stapled on this little thing, and if you're running something where you have Academy Manufacturer, you can build dozens of artifacts of different kinds, so that to the point where removing the artifacts doesn't become the thing and people need enchant removal. Enchants typically are slightly harder to remove than artifacts.
I think one of the last alternate win cons that we really just have to talk about, it just came off of the ban list, is Coalition Victory. How do you feel about this card, Tyler?
Coalition Victory. Just as a quick readout, you win the game if you control a land of each basic land type and a creature of each color. I think it's an interesting card. I understand why they banned it originally. They didn't want one card out of nowhere sort of wins. And compared to other win cons, I find this one less fair because of how hard it is to see coming. Kind of similar in the vein of Approach of the Second Sun. Once you cast it the second time, you just win. But that one's a little more transparent because you have to cast it the first time and then draw 7 cards to get it again. But Coalition Victory, it's a 8 cost card, so it's not that bad. But I still think it's less fair than the others, because unlike the others that are an upkeep trigger, this one is just a sorcery, so you can just play it on your turn once you meet the effects. And when it has access to every color, you have Silence from White, blue counter spells, so you're able to really protect this just win that has no way to really be stopped.
I think I'll make an argument for it being weaker than a lot of cards. I think that it's really good they unbanned it. When looking at the ban list for Commander, this is one of the ones I always thought, why? When, especially, with these upkeep ones and then Obeka being in the game, it's almost, easier to do that than Coalition Victory. I think, obviously, you can throw Coalition Victory into, not any deck. I'll just talk about it. I think that it being 5-color restricted, right? So it can only go in 5-color decks is bad for it. It makes it weaker. It costs 8 mana. When I look at 8 mana, I'm looking at cards like Craterhoof Behemoth, right? Moonshaker Cavalry, other overrun cards in a go wide deck that is gonna win the game, similar to the way Coalition Victory is. and it's a sorcery speed. You're most of the time you're going to be looking to cast this on your turn as a sorcery, and the prereqs are kind of steep. And I know that there's a lot of, there's going to be a creature out there that's Wooburg, and there's going to be Leyline of the Guild Pact. If Leyline of the Guild Pact is in your opening hand, right, Leyline effect on the battlefield, but each non-land permanent you control is all colors, and lands you control are every basic type in addition to their other types, right? So this is going to make Coalition Victory a lot easier to hit. But again, you're going to see it against like the very few Wooburg decks that you play against. I think that you're not going to see it very often. It's sorcery speed. It's insanely high costed, whereas Craterhoof Behemoth can go in any green deck and it's going to close out games similar to Coalition Victory.
Yeah, I can agree with all those points. I think at the time when it was banned, it made sense to ban it.
The format's so much faster now, too. I think that there's a lot of ways that you can win faster than Coalition Victory.
All right, and to wrap this up, a little bit on what we think each of our favorite just win cons in general is, and then alternate win cons. For me personally, my favorite just normal win con is just straight damage. I'm a Simic counters go wide kind of guy. My favorite deck I've ever built is actually mono red Zana buff, and I'm a big fan of just doing straight damage to opponents. That's also why you can see why I don't care too much for commander damage, because big commanders I can't just do normal damage, it becomes commander. In terms of a alternate win con, I don't know if I have particularly like one that's a favorite. I usually splash some poison in certain decks just as a final thing, like we talked about earlier, Triumph of the Hordes. But one that holds a little near and dear to my heart is Simic Ascendancy. I mean, it's a counters win con, and as a Simic counters player, I like it. Hawkball was one of my early decks that I really enjoyed, so those are my two like number ones on my win cons. How about you, Tristan?
For sure. I think combat damage is pretty fun, but for me it's got to be like some sort of infinite combo or a way to burn the table down. Like an Aristocrats deck that's going to be recurring stuff while you have a Blood Artist effect out is something that's I personally enjoy. And then the point to combos is like I think it's really interesting to build a combo that can slot into the right power level. You don't want to throw like the Demonic Consultation and Thassa's Oracle into a bracket 2 deck. That would otherwise be a bracket 2 deck, right? But building a win con that is a bracket 3 infinite combo without being like, oh, this person has infinite combo, like destroy them, right? I think that's really interesting. And then if I had to pick from the alternate win cons we talked about today, I think mill would be my favorite. Either self mill or milling out opponents. Just so much value from treating your graveyard as your hand in self mill. And then of course my first precon I ever bought was the Mind Flayers deck. So that's gotta be my favorites.
Well, that's it for the rest of the video today. If you enjoyed the video, please drop a like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.
Bye.
Bye.